South America may not be the first continent to spring to mind as a pioneer of tramway operation. In the latter part of the 19th century, many parts of South America were rich and prosperous. It also attracted considerable investment from overseas. With electrification, hundreds of tram systems were opened, many being built with British, European and North American capital. The very first animal-powered street railway was built at Santiago, Chile in 1858. 100 years later, US Brill-built cars dating from the early 1930s were seen shortly before the city's standard gauge system was closed in February 1959. Separated from the main city network by railway tracks, the isolated, privately owned standard gauge Santiago Weste Railway outlived the city trams, but by 1964 was in a state of advanced decrepitude. Of a dozen cars in the depot, only one seemed operable. The line was just about 2 miles long, dead straight, running for some 20 blocks on roadside reservation. Built in 1904, it had been electrified as late as 1929. Car number 2 had a particularly interesting history. Delivered in 1905 from Falkenried of Hamburg, it had started life as a trailer on the Valparaiso system. Later, it was motorized and equipped with double bow collectors. Following closure of the Valparaiso system in 1952, it was transferred with a sister car to eke out its last days creaking in every joint on the Santiago Weste shuttle until abandonment sometime in the late 1960s. The broad gauge railway from Santiago to Valparaiso included the oldest section of passenger line in the southern hemisphere, dating from 1855. It had been electrified in 1924. These views, taken 40 years later, feature the impressive Baldwin-Westinghouse locomotives dating from the 1920s. Batuco, some 20 miles from Santiago, a short branch line was served by a homemade horse-drawn tram. Operated by the Chilean army, it ran some 3/4 of a mile to a nearby ammunition factory. Despite the presence of overhead wires, electric workings have been banned to prevent sparks causing an explosion. This was probably the only known example in the world of animal power permanently superseding electric traction. The horse tram trundled on until about 1975, thus ending a most unusual operation. The express heading for Valparaiso and the coast was in charge of one of the handsome post-war Baldwin locomotives. Situated on the Pacific, Valparaiso is one of the most British cities in South America and had its first trams as early as 1863. This funicular survives today and is one of 15 incline railways still serving the surrounding hills. Pullman-built trolleybuses had replaced the last trams in 1952. These same vehicles are still in operation today, and one has been preserved in original condition. The British-built meter-gauge Southern Transandean Railway linking Chile and Argentina was only completed in 1910. The Chilean side was electrified in 1927, and the steepest grades, 8% on the Chilean side, 6% on the Argentinian, were rack-operated. The line climbed to over 10,000 feet at the summit tunnel, and on the Argentine side was worked by powerful Kitson-Meyer rack and adhesion locomotives until the end. Unusually for a rack line, the locomotives on both sections pulled rather than pushed, which was safer when bucking snowdrifts. With a break of gauge at either end of the line, it never attracted much freight. It finally closed in 1985, passenger trains having been withdrawn 6 years earlier. The eastern terminus of the railway was at Mendoza, which in 1964 still had one remaining tram route, worked by the run-down remnants of a one-time fleet of 63 four-wheelers. Despite strong opposition from local trade unions, the system closed the following year. Number 42, dating from 1925, had been imported from Belgium. Note the distinctive Siemens poles. These 9-window cars also came from Belgium, being part of a batch of 15 delivered in 1928. On this section, boarding was from island platforms on the off-side, dating from the days when traffic in Argentina ran on the left-hand side. Trolleybuses had started replacing the trams in 1958, and these vehicles, the only Japanese-built trolleybuses outside of Japan, remain in service in 1995. In the 1960s, train travel in Argentina was both popular and comfortable, but political turmoil in recent years has resulted in a virtual disappearance of passenger traffic. As in many other parts of the continent, the railways ran on the left, reflecting the major influence of both British engineers and capital. As a result of the rundown of the giant Pacific Electric interurban network centered around Los Angeles, several classes of car were sold to the General Urquiza Railway in Buenos Aires. This, too, was an interurban-style operation, with a long trunk line to Campo de Mayo, plus a branch to San Martin. M1759 formed part of a batch of 28 all-steel brills dating from 1925. These center-entrance Hollywood cars had been sold to Argentina in 1951. Also sold in the same year were the 50 all-steel 1100s, dating from 1924-5. These 60-seaters had 4 110-horsepower motors. Note, the trolley poles were not in use as the railway had embarked upon a conversion to third rail in 1955, although the PE cars were equipped for dual operation. The 1100s were provided with railroad-style train vestibules in Argentina. The two classes survived on the system until early 1974. Amazingly, the railway had started life as a 60-mile horse tramway, even boasting overnight horse-powered sleeper cars. Electrification had commenced in 1907. Further acquisitions from California included the distinctive articulated bridge cars from the Key system. Dating from the late 1930s, these have been built to provide a fast service from San Francisco across the Bay Bridge to Oakland and beyond. Following withdrawal in 1958, they had been partially dismantled, but were hastily reassembled upon their sale to Argentina, the first entering service in February 1962. These high-capacity bridge cars had a reputation for being both noisy and slow. They were already equipped for dual third rail and overhead current collection. Colour views of the XPE cars taken in the early 1960s, this being the terminal station in Buenos Aires. Note the former PE electric loco. A rare view of XPE PCCs. They proved unsuccessful, only operating from 1959 to 62 before being replaced by the more robust bridge cars. A Buenos Aires city car crosses the interurban, movements being controlled by a distinctly British-style signal box. Argentina had been virtually a British colony, with most of its industry, shipping and transport interests being owned and managed by British companies. Traffic, for example, had driven on the left until 1945. The Anglo-Argentine Tramway Company controlled one of the largest tramway empires on Earth. In 1920, Buenos Aires had 2,700 trams, 400 miles of track, 19 depots and 11,400 employees. Even at the beginning of 1962, there were still 1,200 trams on 36 routes. The first electric vehicles had come from the States, but from 1905, English companies exported over 3,000 trams to South America, mostly to Argentina. Gradually, the country's railways and tramways were appropriated by the state during the 1930s and 40s. With a few exceptions, all Buenos Aires cars were four-wheelers, a restriction dictated by the preponderance of narrow streets and sharp curves in the central area, which necessitated much one-way working. Most of the BA fleet had British-built motors and controllers. During the 40s and 50s, many of the single truckers received new streamlined bodies, some being distinguished by American-style standee windows. These were assembled at a number of local factories, and the various groups were usually known by the name of the factory or works involved. Tramcar rebuilding became a lucrative industry, and despite the politically motivated decision taken in 1957 to swiftly abandon the system, the rebuilding program continued, with dozens of brand new, unused bodies being burnt as they came off the assembly lines in a grotesque act of vandalism. A staggering 1,200 trams were withdrawn during 1962, so that by February 1963 only 2 tram routes remained in the Buenos Aires conurbation. These were the 2 independent lines in Lanús. They had survived because of the appalling state of the unmade roads served by routes 51 and 52. Although the Lanús system was separate from Buenos Aires, there had been through track connections and through running in the 1950s. In 1964, the trams were owned by a workers' cooperative. Latterly, the fleet consisted of 30 of the Buenos Aires rebuilds, still on their original Brill 21E trucks and numbered 1 to 30. Since electrification in 1922, Lanús had relied upon utilizing second-hand equipment from its nearby neighbor. the undertaking never purchased any new vehicles. The two routes were mainly single track, with widely spaced passing loops. The 52 was abandoned in mid-1964, with the 51 following on New Year's Eve. This was the last tram route in the Buenos Aires area. The nearby provincial capital La Plata had two standard gauge systems until municipalization in 1948. An Argentinian company with Brills and St. Louis built trams, and an English company operating with Preston-built United Electric four-wheelers. Both types survived until the late 1950s, when there were still 135 cars on 16 routes. Many of these older veterans were displaced with purchase of 70 rebuilt Buenos Aires cars in the early 1960s. Known in Argentina as Estombas, they were from an original 1935 batch of cars which had been given their new streamlined bodies at the Buenos Aires Tramways Estomba works. They retain their British-built Brill 21E trucks, motors and controllers. By 1965, only two routes remained, one of which only operated every 80 minutes. The coloured band below the window denoted the depot to which the car was allocated. Some cars had also been repainted in a new green livery. The end came late on Christmas Day, 1966, making La Plata, briefly renamed Eva Perón, the last city in Argentina to operate trams. Until recently, Paraguay had a reputation for being one of the world's most isolated and backward nations, but today it still has one of the few remaining traditional tramways in South America. Asunción is truly a remarkable survivor. Electrification dated from 1913, and by 1939 there were 10 routes in operation. However, by the late 1940s only two lines survived, worked by a mixed collection of run-down four-wheelers built in Argentina, England, Italy and the USA. Unfortunately, due to extensive rebuilding during the 1930s, it was difficult to distinguish the origins of the various cars. This, for example, was a 1935 Buenos Aires-built Catita car. The 6¼ number 10 to Villamora had started life as a steam tramway in 1894, with American-built steam tram locos hauling English-built double-deck trailers. The steam trams were replaced by an extension of the electric system in 1932. The outer rural section was single track with two passing loops. Note the distinctive arched Siemens poles. A batch of some 10 to 12 of the Buenos Aires standy window streamliners were acquired in 1963. In the downtown, the trams followed a lengthy one-way loop. Note the main railway station in the background. Inbound along Palmer. Outbound via Australia. In 1973, the operating company closed the system, but in 1975, the 2.5-mile Route 5 was reopened, following acquisition of a rebuilt 4-wheel Brussels Standard car. This vehicle looked extremely smart, alongside the refurbished and repainted veterans, like this 1935 Buenos Aires Catita car. This standy window streamliner. And number 4, a Brill of 1929. More views on the downtown loop. This rare sequence, taken in March 1976, showed 1604 hauling matching trailer 603, which the Brussels authorities had dispatched free of charge. As there was no turning circle at the outer limit of the 5, the trailer was of little use, so the set made this special journey for the benefit of the photographer. Some enthusiasts started the rumor that the Asuncion system owed its survival to the personal intervention of the then President Alfredo Stroessner, whom it was claimed was a closet tramway supporter. However, it seems more likely that hard economics led to their reopening. They avoided using imported fuel, the second-hand Brussels cars were inexpensive, there was a possible tourist potential, and the country had plentiful supplies of cheap electricity. The interior of a standy window Buenos Aires streamliner. Travelling out now along Service 5. The handbrake was in the form of a wheel. A Catita car swings onto España. 1604 was standing on the tracks leading to and from the depot. Drivers tended only to stop for female passengers in most of South America. This outer section of the 5 was constructed in the late 1940s. Movements through this passing loop alternated between left and right-hand running, depending on the position of the points as left by the previous car. Until 1945, traffic in Paraguay had run on the left. The bow flips over at the terminus, 2.5 miles from downtown. By mid-1978, all the older cars had gone, being replaced by a further 15 motor cars acquired from Brussels. Included were 6 of the 9,000 class rebuilds. As part of the rebirth of the system, approximately 1.5 miles of the former Via Mora line was reactivated and operated as Service 9. A reversing Y was constructed to accommodate the single-ended cars. The operation of the 9 proved to be short-lived. Another Y was required at the outer terminus of the 5. Each car had a driver and conductor, and there were frequent ticket inspections. During this period, the undertaking had a distinctly military flavour, access to the depot being strictly forbidden. Occasionally, the clogged points were cleared to give access to Line 9, which had ceased regular operation in the early 1980s, although, as on this occasion, spasmodic trips were made. Once, the whole route was cleaned up for one return trip by visiting enthusiasts. By the mid-1980s, the system had settled down to the 2.5-mile 5, worked by the 3 batches of Brussels 4-wheelers. Understandably, Asuncion has become a mecca for Belgium enthusiasts. Travelling northwest now across the Andes into Peru, which in 1960 still had 2 tramways. Lima, the capital, was linked to the harbour of Callao and onto La Punta by a 10-mile high-speed interurban. Latterly, base service was provided by 20 former 3rd Avenue lightweight cars acquired in 1947. Interestingly, these had started life as single-truck convertibles before being rebuilt and mounted on Brill's 77E bogies in 1934-5. For many years, the line had been closely paralleled by the first railway built in the Southern Hemisphere in 1851, which closed in the 1930s. The high-speed tramway was virtually dead straight and was the only line in Lima equipped for pantograph operation. In contrast, trolley poles were used on the 8-mile suburban line which linked Lima to the coastal town of Chorrillos. This was work by a mixed bag of double truckers, including some classic Brills and St. Louis cars. Achieving high speeds, motormen made liberal use of their air horn. However, the mainstay of the line were these Italian-built arched-window double trolley cars dating from the 1920s, when control of Lima's tramways had passed to an Italian company. Some hauled virtually identical trailers. The Chorrillos line, opened in 1904, had been the first electric railway in Peru, and interestingly, reflecting the level of traffic, there were a couple of other electric lines linking the same 2 points. Back now on the Callao Interurban. Approaching Lima, ex-3rd Avenue 229 was inbound from Callao. Sharing work on the line were Brill master units dating from the 1930s. Note the former mounting for the trolley pole. Downtown Lima. In 1960, the city had a population of just under 1.5 million. A pair of braiders pulls away on the start of their 8-mile journey to Chorrillos. The 3 surviving city routes were all worked by Braider-built single truck cars dating from the 1920s, as was the city's 3rd suburban line, the 5-mile M to San Miguel. A trolley-equipped 3rd Avenue car followed a single trucker round a terminal loop. The narrow, congested central area had several stretches of one-way working in parallel streets. Note the typical Spanish colonial architecture. Further scenes on the Chorrillos route. This trailer does not have the distinctive roof-mounted ventilators. Another delightful turn-of-the-century veteran, probably on the one-way terminal loop at Chorrillos. Clerestory roof double truckers. Another of the handful of Brill master units. Reflecting South America's political turmoil, operations in the city came to an abrupt end on Friday, September the 17th, 1965. The following day, employees staged a strike for higher wages, and despite the fact that the army was specially trained to operate the trams, the system never reopened. 500 miles to the south of Lima was a small 3-foot 6-gauge electric system at Arequipa, which had opened in 1913. These views date from 1931, when the system was still under 20 years old. The clerestory roof brills dated from electrification. .502 was one of a pair of brill 4-door Burneys delivered new in 1924. 301 was probably rebuilt from a short 26-foot-long centre-entrance California-style double trucker. At this time, the cars offered both first and second-class accommodation. These extremely rare scenes were taken on the Tingo line, closed in 1947. By the 1960s, all services were through-routed across town. The city had a fascinating mixture of original and second-hand cars, most of which had been rebuilt. .502 heads out of town past the Bull Ring. .201 was a rebuild of an original 1913 clerestory car, but still on its Brill 21E truck. Arequipa numbered their fleet according to type, most classes only having a couple of cars. Relatively few Burney safety cars were exported overseas. Arequipa had 2 and subsequently rebuilt other single truckers to resemble them. They also rebuilt their second-hand double-truck acquisitions. For example, 701 was one of a pair purchased from Elmira, New York. Owing to the number of tight curves in confined spaces, all double truckers were foreshortened, which made the 2X 3rd Avenue cars acquired in 1947 virtually unrecognizable. Another of the ex-Elmira cars acquired in 1939. A former Memphis double trucker. A battered Burney bravely battles along the worn rails on one of the 6 lines still operating in 1958. Boarding was usually on the run. 602 was one of the city's Burney lookalikes, mounted on a Brill 79E truck. Another ex 3rd Avenue car in a poorer part of downtown. Double truck rebuild 301. In 1964, the system had a collection of 31 cars, of which over half were double truckers. Outer suburban views. Overlooked by the snow-capped volcano El Misti, an ex-Almira car rumbles slowly over the famous stone bridge en route to the slaughterhouse. The undertaking even possessed a motorized meat tram. Views on the highly scenic line to Paucapata, a must for all visiting American enthusiasts. "804 was one of 8 former Memphis trolleys mounted on Brill 39E reversed maximum traction bogies. It is believed the entire Arequipa system closed in July 1966. "300 miles due east of Arequipa on the other side of the Andes is La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, which stands at the extraordinary altitude of 12,000 feet. 4 different railways, all meter gauge, converged on La Paz in 1964, and the city proved to be home to some of the last shays in the world. These incredible machines ensured every ounce of weight was available for adhesion, and although an engineering nightmare of splines, couplings and gears, they were ideal for tackling sharp curves and severe grades, where speed is of no consequence. One of the tasks for the shays was to exchange traffic with the Guaqui Railway, or FCG, which had opened its new electrified El Alto-La Paz line in 1905, making it the first electric line in South America. Loco number 32 was built by the English Electric Company in 1930. '22, a real treasure, was a Brill baggage and express car dating from 1906. Electric locos 30 and 31 were semi-permanently coupled together. La Paz is situated nearly 2.5 miles above sea level in the bottom of a vast crack, which is nearly 1,500 feet below the surrounding desert plateau. To reach the summit at El Alto, the FCG made the colossal climb by adhesion only in just 5.5 miles, on grades of 7% or close to 1 in 14. The center rail was used solely for braking on the descent. In many respects, it was akin to a roadside tramway. It would take an hour for the slow-moving train to crawl along the side of the valley, hauling its maximum load of 60 tons up to the summit, and the connecting steam-haul trains. This 280 was built by the Avonside Engine Company of Bristol in 1930. 30 and 31, built in the USA by General Electric in 1904, had been on the line since its inception and had earlier been numbered 130 and 131. Reflecting La Paz's extraordinary isolation, virtually all heavy material and equipment was brought in through Peru and then via the FCG. The city had operated conventional trams from 1909 to 1950. In 1964, the only passenger movements on the FCG were provided by a couple of single-ended diesel rail cars. These were hauled backwards up the terrifying grades, much to the consternation of the uninitiated. On arrival at the summit, the box wagons were then taken forward by steam on the 55-mile journey to Lake Titicaca, where there was a railway carrying steamer connection into Peru. Number 10 was built by Hunslet as late as 1955. The two vintage American steeple cabs were then hitched to the wagons, making the journey back down to the city. The rail cars, meanwhile, prepared to set off for Guaqui and Lake Titicaca. Now the amazing electric line has gone and the track lifted, although many priceless pieces of equipment have been preserved. Brazil, the fifth largest country in the world, once had over 100 tram systems. There were strong American, British and Canadian influences, both in terms of the operating companies as well as in the variety and design of the rolling stock. Portuguese is the official language of Brazil, and because most of the tramways were financed by the issue of bonds, the streetcars or trams were usually known locally as bonges. Despite some abandonments, a rich diversity of equipment could still be found even in the late 1950s. Travelling from south to north, the most southerly operation was in the small town of Rio Grande do Sul. Somewhat unusually, this system had been initially owned and operated by a French company. By the mid-1950s, it was under municipal control, worked by an aging fleet of single truckers. In many ways, Rio Grande typified the problems facing the smaller Brazilian undertaking. Originally open, these brills, dating from 1911, had been rebuilt twice, but now they were worn out, as was the permanent way. The foreign companies had invested insufficient capital, and the cash-starved municipalities were reluctant to embark on a costly reconstruction program, preferring instead to use buses. The old curved-side trailer had also formerly been open, and probably dated from 1911. At its maximum, there were 15 miles of track, serving a population of 70,000. The end came on the 15th of June 1967, when the system was described by a visitor as being in absolutely appalling condition. Porto Alegre, Happy Port, not only had some vintage vessels on the river, but also an extensive tramway with a fascinating collection of double-ended rolling stock, which indeed made it a happy port of call for visiting enthusiasts. Included were groups of single truckers built by the United Electric Car Company of Preston between 1909 and 1920. Although much rebuilt, some of these English veterans remained until final closure in 1971. Between 1928 and 1954, the system was operated by an American control company, which not only ordered 20 new double truckers, but also purchased a wealth of second-hand US-built cars, including representatives from Boston, Massachusetts, York, Pennsylvania, Staten Island, Baltimore, and Miami. Over the years, the majority of the cars were either rebuilt or modified, making swift identification difficult. Some double truckers even consisted of two Bernies spliced together. Most services terminated at various loops in the central area. "25 cars came from Worcester, Massachusetts. These Brill Master units were delivered new in 1929. And Osgood Bradley from Staten Island. One of the spliced-together Bernies. Left-hand running had been in force until 1935. The temperate climate meant none of the cars had any doors, which also reduced maintenance costs. The stylish semi-streamline livery was introduced in the 1950s. As late as 1961, there were still 100 cars carrying nearly 90 million passengers annually. Another of the Bernie hybrids. Abandonments began in 1963. Porto Alegre, which had been the second Brazilian system to open in 1864, became the penultimate major system to close on the 8th of March 1970. It was also the last standard gauge tramway in Brazil. The last big system to close was Santos. Mule cars had arrived here in 1871 and electrification had been carried out by the English-owned City of Santos Improvements Company, the first line opening in 1909. The bulk of the early electric fleet came from Hearst Nelson, and the Scottish company continued to supply its sole South American customer until 1951. Coming into view, a rare glimpse of one of the two homemade high-capacity articulated cars. The trams were all originally open, being of either the single truck or double truck variety. From 1919 to 1942, the company also built similar vehicles itself. Bogie trailers were also used. In 1952, the system came under municipal control, and 2 years later work began on a program of rebuilding the former open cars. The gauge was an unusual 4 foot 5 inches. This funicular was opened in 1926, and despite one serious accident, is still functioning today. In the 1960s, when these views were taken, there were still some 130 motor cars and 80 trailers offering a fairly intensive service on 30 routes, many of which overlapped. There were several impressive track layouts. This motor car was one of several early Hearst Nelson deliveries. An 11-bench motor car. Canvas blinds on the open cars gave some protection against tropical rainstorms. These scenes were taken on the east side route serving the docks. Besides being one of the oldest cities in Brazil, Santos also handled approximately half the country's trade, including most of the world's coffee. Since 1919, all passenger trams had carried even numbers only. Vestibules were added to some of the open cars, and bow collectors were fitted to the entire fleet in 1933. In the early 1960s, a more modern style livery had been adopted. This rebuilt double trucker sported a striking red flash. These next sequences show the level of transformation undertaken during the rebuilding program. It was said revenue collected on the newly enclosed cars paid for their reconstruction within 2 months by eliminating fare dodgers clinging to the sides of the open cars. Trolleybuses were introduced in 1963, increasing inroads being made into the tram system until the last cars were withdrawn on the 28th of February 1971. Some veteran open cars remained almost to the end. The tramway closed just 100 years after the opening of the first mule line. "20 miles east of Santos is one of the world's most remote and rarely visited tramways, which can only be approached by ferry. Permission to ride and photograph the private line must be obtained in advance. In 1958, the Santos Docks Company electrified their 4.5-mile single-track line, linking the remote hydroelectric plant at Itachinga with the dock on the river of the same name. Built in 1906, the line transported men and materials to the site of the hydroelectric plant. Much of the right-of-way is laid through inhospitable, swampy terrain. The gauge is 800 millimeters or 2 foot 7.5. Nearly 90 years later, it is still carrying employees and equipment. Car 1 arrives at Itachinga. Here there are several loops and sidings. There are only 2 motor cars. They were built locally using second-hand trucks, motors and controllers. They may hold the record for being the shortest double truck cars in the world. Except for the tramway with its hourly service, the residents of this isolated community are completely cut off from the outside world. The Itachinga hydroelectric plant supplies power for the Santos railways and docks. Seen at the ferry, car number 2 is most unusual in having a centrally positioned controller. Often called the Chicago of Brazil, modern Sao Paulo has a population of 18 million. When most of these scenes were taken in 1958, it was a mere 4 million. It was a bustling, thriving industrial city, roughly twice the size of Rio. The first animal-powered line opened in 1872 and the first electric line in 1900. This was built and operated by a Canadian empire called Brazilian Traction Light and Power. By 1936, there were over 186 miles of track, making it the second largest system in the country. When it passed into municipal control in 1947, there was a mixed bag of some 690 trams in stock. 10 years later, some closures had already taken place, but 53 services remained with some 500 cars. The newest additions were 75 ex-Third Avenue former conduit trams acquired in 1947. Because of their centre doors, these Peter Witt-style lightweights were known as Centex in their new home. Only odd numbers were carried by passenger cars, so they were numbered from 1701 to 1849. These views were taken on the city's outer belt route. In 1955, work began on totally enclosing some former open cars. 115 was from a batch of 50 St. Louis-built cars delivered in 1902. .259 was also in virtually original condition. 469 gives clear evidence of body fatigue caused by years of vigorous applications of the handbrake. Another former open car bucks and sways along a stretch of worn-out rail. The high cost of track renewal, coupled with an aging fleet, many of which were frequently out of service due to breakdowns, was eventually to seal the fate of the Sao Paulo streetcars. As all operation was single-ended, some vehicles had protective screens on the offside only, giving them a distinctly lopsided look when fully loaded. Unrebuilt single truckers on the curving route out into the northwest suburb of Casa Verde. By 1958, number 99 had already clocked up 56 years of service. .1527 was one of 100 new cars built by the Canadian Car and Foundry in 1926-7. An ex-works rebuild of a former 13-bench open double truck car. On arrival in Sao Paulo, the Third Avenue conduit cars had received trolley poles and been converted to single-ended operation. Built between 1936 and 1938, these elegant Huffliners saw more service in their new home than in New York. By 1963, the system had shrunk to 220 motor cars and 30 trailers, although there were still some 27 routes. Like many South American undertakings, Sao Paulo also had some weird and wonderful works cars. In 1964, a post office handcart was being trundled sedately through the downtown. In 1960, it had been announced that the life-expired streetcars would all be gone by 1968, replaced in part by armies of belching buses. In the 60s, some cars were repainted in traction orange with cream roof. Trolleybuses had first appeared in 1949, and the network gradually expanded at the expense of the trams. In January 1967, the last city trams disappeared, leaving just the truncated outer portion of the long Santo Amaro route, which was predominantly on private right-of-way and had been intended for conversion into a metro. It was worked by survivors from the Canadian-built cars, the famous Shrimps, so nicknamed because of their original pink livery. The end came on the 27th of March 1968, when a procession of 12 cars made a final round trip, thus ending 96 years of tramway operation. 63 miles northwest of Sao Paulo is the attractive city of Campinas. This was the only railroad roof 10-bench car in the fleet. All other vehicles, which had either been built locally or else dated from electrification in 1912, had been altered in the 1920s, when their platforms were enclosed, their clerestories removed, and their crossbenches reduced from 10 to 9. Some, like 117, also had their bulkheads removed. In 1963, Campinas was still served by a compact network of 12-metre gauge routes, with some 28 virtually identical cars. To alleviate congestion in the downtown, the various termini were separated but situated adjacent to each other. The layout was almost entirely single track with passing loops, some of which were in quite narrow streets. Abandonments began in earnest in 1964, with the last car entering the depot on the 24th of May 1968. One of the last survivors was a 4.5-mile remnant of the former 20-mile interurban to Cabras, meaning goats, reflecting the rural nature of the line. The bulk of this service had closed in 1960. Latterly, an unadvertised car swayed along the decaying right-of-way every hour. In the past, several Campinas cars have been sold to the nearby town of Piracicaba, which in 1963 had a population of just 80,000. This tiny meter-gauge operation had 5 miles of track, 5 cars and 1 trailer. The 3 single-track routes had been built by the English-owned Brazilian Traction Company between 1916 and 1922. The trams had passed into municipal ownership in 1950. All the 9-bench cars had come from Campinas, which had close ties with Piracicaba, whilst the unique 10-bench number 3 was believed to have been acquired from Belo Horizonte. Number 2 was later to enjoy a new lease of life on a museum line in Campinas. Enthusiasts from the United States referred to Piracicaba as the Fort Collins of Brazil because of striking similarities with the equally small Colorado system, closed in 1951. Both had delightful little single truckers, and each had 3 routes which met in the town centre at regular intervals. A brief glimpse of number 3 with its roof-mounted indicator box. 2 of the lines closed in 1967, leaving the Agricultural College route to stagger on until the 3rd of October 1969. A further delightful gem was yet another three-route system, this time at São Carlos. By 1958, there were 9 motor cars, displaying odd numbers only from 1 to 17, operating over 10 miles of track. The original 6 cars had been imported from Belgium in 1914, whilst others were locally built replicas. Some of the trams have been given protective windscreens. Unusually, for such a small network, identifying route numbers and coloured route boards were used. At the southern end of Route 2, there was an unusual crossing with the electrified Paulista Railway. Outbound conductors simply pulled the bow and the car coasted across. The São Carlos network was noted for its many steep hills. Note the conductor collecting fares. Crossing the railway on the return journey to town involved a unique manoeuvre. The conductor lowered the bow, connected a cable between the bow and the end of the trolley wire, then walked the car across the railway tracks before raising the bow on the other side. The centre consisted of a maze of single-track one-way workings. Note the heavily embossed company crest on the front dash. This was one of a few systems in Brazil to be operated by the same company with virtually the same cars from inception to closure. When the end came in June 1962, the bad track and worn-out cars had reduced things to little more than walking pace. Here, number 17 rumbles up a typical hilly, cobbled street. In complete contrast, the 30-mile-long meter-gauge interurban centred upon Campos de Jordão ran through the scenic mountainous area 100 miles northeast of Sao Paulo. The line was constructed in 1924 by the English Electric Company on the track bed of an earlier steam railway. The mainline stock also came from Britain. However, since 1956, the local tram service provided over the final outer 5 miles of the line had been worked by 3 German-built trams, purchased from the defunct system at Guarujá. Built variously from 1924 to 1930, the trio were given the fleet numbers A5 to A7. All, much rebuilt, remain in service today, together with the original electric stock, also much rebuilt. And so to Rio de Janeiro, one-time capital of Brazil and centre of a complex and richly diverse network of tramways, the remnants of which had come under control of the state-owned Rio Public Transport Company on the 1st of January 1964. Included was the remarkable Campo Grande system, situated some 25 miles west of Rio. It had 3 lines serving a sparsely populated, predominantly rural area. .361, recently transferred from Rio, was still carrying its original fleet number. By mid-1964, some of the long-serving cars, all of which had been acquired second-hand from Rio, were in the new company livery of silver and blue. The Bombay roof trailers dated from the late 1890s. The 10-mile standard gauge route to Pedra, electrified in 1917, had partially replaced a narrow gauge mule line built in 1894 to transport hay to be sent to feed the mules hauling the Rio trams. An even longer line to Ilia had followed in 1920. Latterly, speeds were agonizingly slow. For example, the journey time for the 12.5-mile trip to Ilia was 2 hours, equal to just over 6 miles an hour. By 1964, the track was in appalling condition. The conductor is using the fare register, standard procedure on most Brazilian open cars. "296 was another recent arrival from Rio. Severe drops in voltage at the outer ends reduced the cars to little more than a crawl. Speeds worsened if even the slightest gradient was encountered. Despite low fares, the slow-moving trams were no match for the army of competing buses, and the Ilia and Pedra lines were abandoned in October 1964 and early 1965 respectively, very shortly after these views were taken. The surviving 7.5-mile urban section operating past the railway station closed on the 31st of October 1967. Rio itself had the first animal-powered steam and electric trams in Brazil. 2 companies dominated the city, both operating large standard gauge networks. The Canadian-owned Rio de Janeiro Tramway Light and Power, known locally as the Light, and the Brazilian-owned Botanical Garden Company. Although financially independent of each other, they have been interconnected since 1909 and had long shared cars, track and services. This was the original Botanical Garden Company depot and site of the first electric railway of any kind to operate in the Western Hemisphere outside of North America. It had opened in 1892. The Botanical Garden Company operated routes 1 to 24, serving the southern zone of the city, whilst the Light Company ran in the central and northern areas with routes 25 to 99. In 1950, the 2 companies had over 400 miles of track, 130 works cars, and over 1,400 passenger cars, of which some 3/4 have been built locally, on trucks imported from the States, and with controllers and motors from England. The twin fleets were remarkably uniform. With a few exceptions, all were open cars with either 10 or 13 benches. Single-ended operation had been introduced in the 1920s, the running boards being removed and protective wire-mesh panels being added on the offside. These were aimed at eliminating fare dodgers as well as improving safety. Hauling a matching trailer, this was one of the semi-streamlined design of car introduced in the late 1940s. Turning into the impressive Botanical Garden Company terminus on the Lago de Carioca in the downtown. Amongst the cars entering the loop were several of the typical Rio 13-bench double-truck clerestory roof cars. Most were of the Narragansett type with twin running boards. 8 of this type, plus 2 single truckers, were later sold to US museums. Bow collectors have been in use since 1905. Note the twin running boards on this Narragansett car. Another of the 50 semi-streamliners. These were known locally as the lion tamers, as they had effectively tamed the thousands of young lions who had traditionally stolen free rides by clinging to every conceivable bit of the open cars. The Light Company continued rebuilding trams to a remarkably high standard almost until final closure. Narrow city streets, increasing traffic congestion, plus an anti-streetcar policy escalated the pace of closure instigated in the early 1950s. As in Buenos Aires, the huge system was eliminated swiftly and decisively. Trolleybuses began displacing the former Botanical Company routes in September 1962, with the last car running on the 21st of May 1963. On the 1st of January 1964, the remaining northern routes passed to the new Rio Public Transport Company, but all the lines, with the exception of the scenic Alta de Boa Vista route and 2 isolated services in Cascajora, were gone by early 1965. A hurricane swept the Cascajora lines into oblivion in January 1966, and although Alta de Boa Vista, which had been retained as a tourist operation with 10 rebuilt cross-bench cars, was reopened, another storm finally led to its demise on the 21st of December 1967. Since 1967, the only traditional trams in Rio have been the unique narrow-gauge ferrocarril Carioca, or the Bonjis de Santa Teresa. These views, taken in the 1950s, show city cars passing beneath the widened center span of the famous 18th century aqueduct. The disused double-arch structure spanning the valley offered engineers the perfect solution in linking the densely populated Santa Teresa hills with the downtown. Opened across the aqueduct in September 1896, The gauge was an unusual 1100 millimetres, or 3 foot 7¼ inches. It was the first totally electric tramway in South America and the second electric line to open in Rio. 3 routes were built, but in recent years only 2 remained. Today, the trams hold a special place in the affections of the people, but the system nearly disappeared in the early 1960s, and it was only the 400th anniversary celebrations of the city, coupled with the tenacious determination of a local politician, Senora Osborne, that ensured the trams and the aqueduct survived the developers. It remains one of the truly great tram rides in the world. Snaking round the winding single-track section to Paula Matos. The outer section of the Silvestri line, seen here, was closed in 1966. An outbound car has deposited its trailer before tackling the final section up to Silvestri. Here, connections were made with the meter-gauge, rack-operated Corcovado Railway, used by generations of tourists to reach the statue of Christ on the Corcovado Peak. Opened as a steam railway in 1884-5, the 2.5-mile line was electrified in 1910, with rolling stock consisting of 4 Swiss-built locomotives, each coupled to a 72-seater wooden coach, with the electric loco working downhill and taking power by a pair of trolleys on separate wires. Approaching Corcovado. The trolleys were lowered for the descent. In these 1967 views, the increasingly obsolete stock has been repainted. This line too was threatened with extinction, but has since been totally renovated. A baggage car at Silvestri. Silvestri station on the Corcovado line has since been closed. Following hurricane damage, the Silvestri line was cut back in 1966 to terminate at Deutscher Maus, although it was re-extended a very short distance in 1975. Prior to closure of the Silvestri section, a motor car picks up its trailer for the journey back down into the city. Trailer operations ceased after 1966. Suspended some 140 feet above the ground. "101, the only enclosed car. The junction of the 2 routes. This was the new 1964 livery. The present cars were built locally, using the original Peckham cantilever trucks. Currently, they have 2 75-horsepower motors acquired from English Electric in 1933-4. Over the years, the stock has been much rebuilt, but they retain a strong traditional flavour. On the aqueduct, the clearance between the parapets is limited, and passengers are only protected by flimsy wire netting. The aqueduct was cleaned and restored as part of the 400th anniversary celebrations. High amongst the Santa Teresa hills is a bizarre petrol-driven monorail built in 1940. It provides connection between the trams and a hillside apartment block and is situated approximately halfway along the main tram route. This peculiar contraption is still functioning today. The Carioca trams have had no fewer than 6 different city termini. The present ones for the little electric cars is situated somewhat ironically on the roof of the garage of Brazil's national oil company. Opened in 1975, it was built on the site of the former San Antonio Hill, which was steadily removed. In times past, the trams had gone a further half-mile towards the central area. By the early 1980s, the surviving trams, much rebuilt, had been renumbered and painted in yet another livery. Sadly, the tramway has gained something of an unsavoury reputation, with some unsuspecting visitors being subjected to assault and theft. Note one of the system's 3 works cars. Paulo Matos Terminus. Back in 1964, frequent ferries made the 20-minute trip across the bay to Niterói, whose once extensive tram system had dwindled to 4 routes, worked by a fleet of double truck cars. 4 basic types remained: rebuilt original St. Louis cars dating from 1906, or else locally built replicas. Some totally enclosed single-ended streamliners, probably rebuilds, the bulk of which had entered service since 1957. Totally enclosed rebuilds, and some, like this Narragansett type, appeared to be in original condition. The meter-gauge electric system had been constructed by German engineers, with bow collectors being used from the outset. At its maximum, Niterói had 60 miles of track, 93 passenger cars and 71 trailers. Trolleybuses were introduced in 1953 and transport in the city passed into municipal control in 1961. The streamliners were probably rebuilds of the more traditional open crossbench double truckers. All termini consisted of a loop or reversing triangle. Latterly, the cars made an appalling racket, grinding their way over the worn rails. 521 made the final trip along the southern coastal line on the 31st of July, 1964. The bay ferries included some magnificent specimens, such as this US-built vessel with its walking beam paddle engine. When filmed, it was the last operating example in the world. 750 miles north of Rio was the country's 4th largest tramway at Salvador Bahia. This was another refuge for second-hand US equipment, including 25 Osgood Bradleys acquired from Worcester, Massachusetts in 1946. These were home-built 14-window double truckers. one of 10 cars imported from Brockton, Massachusetts in 1937, and in the background a rebuilt single trucker. The system survived until September 1961. In 1978, a brand new, if somewhat unexpected system was inaugurated at Chiricahua. The car from the nearby São Luís system, closed in 1966, ran along a mile of single track connecting an agricultural college with buses into São Luís. The outer terminus was literally in the middle of nowhere. The line had been built to carry staff and students free of charge and to provide welcome relief from the oppressive tropical heat. One of the main picking up points. Paralleled by a muddy track, the tram ambled across an uninviting scrubland. Note the very low-slung wire. The sole crossbench single trucker had been built by Brill in 1924. Another vehicle was brought to the site but never used. Look, no hands. This unique operation came to an end in 1983, due to sewage construction. Still no hands. Obviously an endearing feature of this enterprising, totally captivating little line. With no report since 1983, no one can confirm whether or not the line remains closed. Undoubtedly, one of the most remote systems in the world was to be found at Manaus, 1,000 miles up the Amazon, deep in the rainforest. Until the collapse of the rubber industry, Manaus had been a prosperous boom town with a wealth of fascinating European-style buildings, including an opera house. The meter-gauge tramway, opened in 1899, which replaced an earlier steam tramway, had given way to buses when these views were taken. The trams, some built in England, had survived until as late as 1957. Nothing quite so exotic remains today for the visiting enthusiast. But there are several surviving tramways, all of a very different nature. Caballito Depot, Buenos Aires. From here, an Exaporto car, number 258, provides a museum service over a one-way system of track used by the city's subway trains to reach their main workshops. Acquired in 1980, 258 has been modified to resemble a Buenos Aires-style car. Service on the 1.5-mile museum loop is provided at weekends only throughout the year. Several other Argentine cities are now considering similar operations. In Asuncion, the 5 still soldiers on, work by the mixed fleet of former Brussels single-enders. The cars still carry their Brussels fleet numbers. Being single-ended and taking up service from the depot and travelling out to the limit of Service 5 involves a long one-way reverse movement. Note the driver is at the other end of the car. Asuncion Depot. This is the last classic standard gauge tramway operation in South America. In Brazil, there are some bodies still in reasonable condition. At Itachinga, the remarkable tramway lifeline still shuttles through the swamps, but remember, advance permission is required. Up in the scenic mountains of Campo de Jordão, the rebuilt trio of elderly German-built trams glide along the final 5 miles of the English-built interurban. Operated by the Ministry of Sport and Tourism, the trams offer a useful service for the thousands of visitors who flock to this idyllic alpine-style resort area, famed for its festivals of art and music, as well as its cooling breezes. Note the central position occupied by the conductor and the turnstile through which all passengers must eventually pass. At Abanécia, midway point on the local tramway, the one platform serves cars from both directions. It is said that the name Abanécia reflects the influence of Scottish immigrants. Working the full length of the 30-mile interurban are these venerable but much rebuilt English electric cars dating from 1924. Note the classic controller still in use. Activity at Emilio Ribas, outer end of the line. A 65-year-old tram sets off on another 10-mile round trip through some of the most delightful scenery in Brazil. Campinas now has a modern LRV, as does Rio on something of an intermittent basis. But in 1972, the Campinas municipality, responding to popular demand, opened a 2.5-mile one-way trolley loop around a local park. Those fortunate enough to visit the city say it is one of the most pleasant lines in the world, well worth a long detour. Although the park has been renamed Portugal, locals and taxi drivers still refer to it as Taquaral. 4 classic single truckers maintain the service. One, 3 and 4 came from the city system, closed in 1968. Number 2, however, had operated at Piracicaba until 1969. In Rio, there is the LRV and the modernized Corcovado line. Reopened in 1979 with new stock on a totally relaid track bed. Like the original cars, these too were built in Switzerland. But the prize must go to the Carioca system. The single truck cars still sway over the ancient viaduct on their way to and from the Santa Teresa hills. Undoubtedly there are risks attached to riding this line, but it remains one of the 7 wonders of the tramway world. Now elevated to the status of a national monument, its future appears secure as it approaches its 100th anniversary. The sturdy little cars with their Brazilian-built bodies, American trucks and British motors serve as a fitting reminder of South America's rich and varied tramway heritage and of the thousands of trams or streetcars which once plied for trade throughout the countries of South America.